the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical Psychology for Today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, voiced by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. In this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from A Perfumed Scorpion by Idries Shah. This audio has been made available by the Idries Shah Foundation. Harmonisation. In order to learn from this institution, it is required that one harmonise with this concept. This harmonisation signals the entry of the individual into the learning situation. The idea of teaching and learning among the Sufis is not always strictly similar to how it is understood in other systems. For example, few people would deny that if you are teaching a student or trying to reach him or her, and his attention is on something else, the real situation is that no teaching or learning is in fact taking place at that moment. The student is absent in reality, though present in physical terms. In conventional schools, everyone knows this, but the fact is usually monitored retrospectively by examinations, tests, or performance. But for the Sufi, the situation is everything. When you are not learning, you are not his pupil, and all responsibility towards you ceases for the period during which you have broken your contract. He seeks, of course, to draw this shortcoming to your attention, or to draw back your attention to the subject. And he tries to do this because he can. Because, that is, he has, in the modern phrase, feedback. He realizes that what he is teaching, which he feels he is conducting, is not finding a correct response. So here we have another peculiarity of Sufi learning. The concept that people's attention or receptivity may alternate in effectiveness is so much more than an observation, so different from a truism, that it is hard to describe it other than to use what is often thought today to be unacceptable terminology. He or she must be in spiritual contact with you in order to know how to help your perceptions and above all your understanding to develop. Imagination. The importance of the spiritual contact has, rightly, been emphasized on many occasions. Naturally, of course, this has led to it being imagined to be the real secret, the only way, the thing which must be persisted in to the exclusion of everything else, so that we have very numerous people and organizations in all countries trying to establish and maintain this contact. The results of such lopsided efforts, of course, are to produce a large number of emotional or even sanctimonious people who imagine that they feel all kinds of things. They can usually be detected by observing whether or not they give ordinary people, those not interested in spiritual and esoteric matters, what is sometimes called the creeps. If they seem weird, they probably are weird, not spiritual. Spiritual communication capacity is not to be grafted onto unsuitable bases. Sufi knowledge is also imparted by exposure to those who have potential already. In detail, this learning is carried out by what we have to call both physical and electronic procedures. But these are so many and so varied, and the very mention of them among excitable or impatient people causes so much emotional stimulus that they are best left to the actual, not the hypothetical, teaching situation. Traditionally, among the authentic Sufis, such studies always take place as part of advanced and carefully ordered programs, though some more visible and familiar circuses portray them as applicable to everyone all the time. Rites, beliefs, practices. From the educational and general theory point of view, it is sometimes quite absorbing for a Sufi to look at the rites, beliefs, and practices of many metaphysical systems, and to note the stage at which the procedures have become ossified. How, for instance, sequences of words or sounds which were quite evidently once instrumental became invested with a holy or almost totemistic importance. How certain beliefs and even working hypotheses became structured into what is now thought to be legend or even literal historical truth. It is quite tempting to speak of this, even to publish on it. But there is a distinct disadvantage. Many of these schools or cults are social phenomena, strongly believed in by their adherents, who have more often than not stabilized their lives and their psychological equilibrium on the literal or allegorical truth of what someone else may see as vestiges, fossils even, of a teaching school. To disturb such a situation can seldom have the kind of salutary results that some optimists might suppose. Apart from hostility, sheer depression can be caused. Quite often, too, nothing at all happens, as I remember from a small experience in Morocco. The Evil Eye. My wife and I went to Morocco when she was expecting a child. She went into a shop and looked at kaftans, and very much liked one of them. The price asked was far too high, and so we left the shop, only to be pursued down the street by the proprietor, who was now trying to give it us for nothing. I asked him why he should give it away like that. "Don't you understand?" he shouted. "What kind of people are you? A woman in that condition, when she covets something, puts the evil eye on anyone who doesn't give it to her. I don't want the evil eye." I said, "That is absolute nonsense, and you know it." "I know it is, but what can I do? You see, I believe it." He knew, and he knew that he knew, but he was helpless. I am not suggesting that the people who are wedded to such misunderstandings are entirely inaccessible. As long as the true facts about something are represented and available, there is always a chance, in fact a certainty, that some will appreciate them. But among the greatest discoveries of humanity, surely, is that it is surpassingly valuable not to mistake one thing for another. Among civilization's greatest weaknesses, I believe, is neglecting this lesson in certain areas. But I am not sure that if you can interest a murderer in mere robbery, you are really making progress in all useful directions. The Sufi effort towards the acquisition of extra-dimensional cognition, in spite of all the qualifications with which I have been compelled to hedge its approach, can be seen in the specialization of its attitudes. By this I mean that if you want to do something and you know something about it, you are often in a better position than a theoretician is to plan the approach to doing it. The desire matched by the means. In the West, great advances of all kinds have been made, and we need not list them, for they surround us, by the application of certain principles. So it is with the Sufis. The difference in approach is the main easily observable distinction. A desire for something, however intense, is basic, but must in both our attitudes be accompanied by a means for obtaining or attaining it. That is how you produce great feats of engineering or physics. But if you approach extra-dimensional knowledge of the Sufi kind as a consumer, or with too many assumptions derived from inapplicably different areas, at the best you will reinvent the wheel. That could take you centuries. So there are 3 approaches. The 3 approaches. In order to select one of them, one must know what they are. Most people do not, in my experience. First, you can try to force your way through by sheer effort. Your experience in your fields, and ours in our own, shows that this does not work for less crude ambitions. Second, you can imagine that you are learning when you are really only consuming or admiring or seeking attention. That is the behavior of the cultist or ignoramus. Third, you can apply principles offered by those who are supposed to know something about the subject already. That is the way. Yet many of the people who want self-realization are not really prepared to adopt the methods offered. A delightful lady of my acquaintance who visited us recently said, "If I don't get higher consciousness before I die, I'm going to be so mad." So, learning how to learn is the Sufi answer, and it is observed by looking closely at Sufi ways of approaching things. 2 ways. One of these ways is represented in Sufi activity by inducing the individual's brain to balance itself so as to enable him to think as effectively about non-sequential things as about others. This is illustrated in a tale where the teacher, effectively, gives his pupil an exercise in thought, which is carried out by attending to the seemingly inexplicable words which he says. A man went to a Sufi and asked, "What are the ways to greater consciousness?" The Sufi said, "The ways of destiny and of great personal effort." "And how," asked the man, "is the way of great personal effort followed?" "That is a matter to be answered in the way of destiny." Another important aspect of being able to learn from the Sufi orientation involves the state of the learner. If he is, for example, liable to react aggressively or masochistically, these barriers will tend to make it difficult for him to progress. Here is an instant of something which I myself observed. The false student learns his falsity. When I was young, I was sitting one day at the entrance to the meeting place of dervishes where I was living. A man who looked like a wandering fakir trudged up to me and said, "I want to see your master." I went inside and told our teacher this, but his only words were, "I refuse to see him." Rather nervous at having to carry such a message, I nevertheless did it. The visiting dervish answered me, "A Sufi cannot, of course, refuse to see a real traveller on the way of truth, yet your master refuses to see me. It has taken this rebuff to teach me that I am not yet really a seeker. In apparently being cruel, he has done me the honour of giving me a lesson. In being seemingly kind, by welcoming me and flattering me, he would have helped perpetuate my ignorance and self-love. I only hope that you, in your turn, will learn as much from this great man as I have today." It does indeed take a lot of learning to differentiate within oneself between indulgent self-abasement and the humility without reward which enables one to learn. In a society where the refusal to see you is only interpretable as due to pressure of work or as a personal affront, it needs a lot of work on oneself. Yet when we say it takes a lot of learning, I cannot fail to observe that it is only a matter of where you put your effort. We have all seen people put more effort than is needed in Sufi study into willing a one-armed bandit to disgorge a jackpot of coins. Come back in 3 years. On another occasion, I learnt how one has to say and do whatever it is that will really help, not something from a book or a list of admonitions. I sat once with a sage who had received a visitor anxious to learn truth and had told him to come back after 3 years. I asked, "Why did you tell him to return in 3 years?" The Sufi said, "My boy, worse advice he could have got anywhere. Better advice he would not have taken." Examining assumptions. I developed the habit of examining my assumptions without this becoming a compulsion through one phrase which I heard in a teaching interchange when I must have been about 12 years old. This was when the Sufi said to someone, "If you have to ask that question, you are not going to be able to understand the answer." As time passed, I worked out how to formulate the questions whose answers might be useful to me. an attitude which can seem perplexing but which trains the mind to be flexible without producing cynicism, is another familiar Sufi preoccupation. One of my teachers put it in this very memorable way to me, and I was able to use it as a framework through which to approach many things, including the very many changes in life and circumstances which befell me. The untaught and the wrongly taught. Hindsight, he said, shows how often yesterday's so-called truth may become today's absurdity. Real ability is to respect relative truth without damaging oneself by refusing to realize that it will be superseded. When you observe that today's controversies often reveal not relevance but the clash of the untaught with the wrongly taught, and when you can endure this knowledge without cynicism as a lover of humankind, greater compensations will be open to you than a sense of your own importance or satisfaction in thinking about the unreliability of others. The assessment of the relative importance or value of people and situations or components of a situation in regard to their learning function is a further Sufi specialization. In other words, things which happen in everyday life may or may not conduce towards learning about humanity and about extra-dimensional reality. One can become aware as to which of these are useful by having allegories or paradigms which recur and which are recalled to the mind and form a guide. One example is contained in this story. The Wise Man and Foolishness. Two men were fighting when a wise man came along. One of them ran off in a rage, and the other said to the newcomer, "I have been practicing placidity and calm for many years, and I am regarded as a religious man, and yet that man, who has become angry, calls me a fool. What good will that do him?" "Ah," said the wise man, "if you are a fool, perhaps by tomorrow, when his temper cools, he will realize that it is vain to argue with fools. But if you are a fool, tomorrow you will almost certainly still be one, in spite of all your experiments in placidity. But he will have learnt something." It will not have escaped your notice that I have been moving from one illustration to another without necessarily linking the two, that we have alternated arguments and verbal statements with tales and imagery, that stress has been placed upon allegory and imagery within a sequential narrative which is not, however, expressed in historical, personality, or logical terms for very long. I have chosen this method of approaching this subject in order to attempt the switching of attention which is characteristic of the Sufi literary techniques of stimulus and what is technically termed scatter, to give you a glimpse, in 20th century terms, of the atmosphere and method of the classical books of the Sufis of the past. I have, of course, changed the allusions to local matters, such as those of 13th century Persia or the 10th and 11th centuries in Central Asia, and I have provided examples of subjects of present-day concern, and I have also made other changes, in order to offer stimuli, and the lack of expected stimuli, analogous to dissertations of those ancient times. This process, in turn, the medieval Sufis developed out of the earlier frameworks which they adapted from the centuries before them, because it is the constant updating of the literature and approaches to specific audiences which most characterizes Sufi activity. This involves, as you will have seen, a method of dealing with materials which is not entirely uninteresting and is certainly selective of materials. But the selectivity is of a different kind from that to which we are accustomed, where perhaps the intention is artistic or didactic. The selection in this case is made to offer a kaleidoscope of impulses, some of them familiar, some of them intended to encourage interest, others to stimulate disagreement. But a major intention behind such materials is to enable the reader or hearer to observe his own reactions, as well as to merely react or to memorize. It is amusing to record that this technique, so easy to observe when one is on the lookout for it, has so confused and so often annoyed scholarly sequential, no doubt, analysts, that they have had very hard things to say about it. Chaotic literature. In the case of Jalaluddin Rumi's Mathnavi, written in the 13th century, literary and Orientalist specialists delight in describing it as chaotic, running off at tangents, being emotional rather than logical, full of information interlarded with tales and stories, and derivative because it is replete with quotations. Yet the Mathnavi, though not understood by everyone, is still regarded as one of the world's literary masterpieces, and by Sufis as a textbook of their schools. Its contemporary value has, of course, been reduced by the fact that present-day readers do not subscribe to all its postulates, and because one needs a Persian cultural background to make full use of its dimensions. Coming, as I do, from a culture saturated in the Mathnavi, even I had to be coached by my teachers in the parallels to Rumi's 13th century concepts before I could make the transition to the Central Asian mentality of my early years. Naturally, nobody less than a major poet could today produce anything as compelling as the form and content of the Mathnavi, but its Sufic scatter plan can nevertheless distinctly be observed and reproduced in a manner adequate for other cultures in continuing its educational work. Discontinuity. Perhaps the greatest heritage of Sufi thought, if we are to review both the literature and the actual Sufi school methods, is the establishment and maintenance, in writing and action, of the principles of flexibility and discontinuity, though not at the expense of adequate lucidity and the capacity for sustained thought. This seems to be nothing less than adding an extra switching mechanism to the established ones. By this I mean that we are all familiar with the process whereby our thinking is, so to speak, switched by others and by outside impacts. We call this the effect of emotion, or the driving force of logical thought, according to the kind of thought which is uppermost. We are also aware of what might be called deliberate thought, when we decide to think about something, either sequentially or holistically. From the latter concept we tend to assume that all our thought is controlled, or that if it is not, it is rightly uncontrolled. Who, for instance, would like to do a kind action as a deliberate decision? It has to be produced by some other impulse, something outside our control, for us to accept it as real. But the relative weakness of the ordinary untrained consciousness in being unable to switch itself off and on, to deepen itself, or to hold certain ideas in abeyance, is seen to be weak when we observe how individuals and numbers of people are played upon, diverted and pulled along channels chosen by others, sometimes acceptably, sometimes otherwise. Among the Sufis, this is regarded as lack of concentration or incomplete mentation. It is, I believe, only those who have not experienced this who tend instantly to imagine that directed thought, directed by oneself to a far greater degree than is usual, would be sure to sacrifice something else. This cannot be preached as a doctrine, since when rendered in mechanical terms, such as those which I have to use to get this down on paper, or into relatively coherent verbal terms, it sacrifices the element which gives this experience its sublime and liberating life. Alas, at a juncture such as this, when one can only speak to a limited extent about things which do not belong to the area of speech, one realizes why, to the fury and bafflement of others, so many Eastern thinkers have to content themselves with saying such things as that. Whoever has the skill to fashion precious jewelry also has the ability to hide it effectively from thieves. And there is an even harsher saying that a moment of truth is of little advantage to whoever needs a good half hour of it. but we can take consolation for the future in the Sufi teacher's somewhat negatively expressed piece of advice, which yet carries within it the instructions as to what one should do next in order to learn more. Do not be that person who puts a grain of rice into a pot with the expectation of drawing forth a handful of food when it is cooked. The Visitor from Space. I am quite sure that there is a very useful and quite unusually fruitful collaboration in the making between Sufi thought in its designed expression and the large number of people in the West who will accept that to them unfamiliar systems may have to be studied by unfamiliar methods. There is a discernible groundswell of opinion which does not want to be sidetracked by cults or satisfied with gimmicks. The first step forward from here is connected with the level of understanding. A colleague of mine in the Middle East emphasized the need for mutual understanding when we met recently, and contributed this very modern Sufi-type tale to submit to you, as a warning that we should not miss the opportunity of communicating, as the people in the story did. Scientists from this world had positioned a satellite to broadcast a call to any passing interplanetary being to show that there was intelligent life on Earth. The apparatus was linked by a translation computer, which was designed to put the visitor's words or signals into English. Sure enough, before very long, a superior being on a space mission came across this device. Recognizing it, he dismounted from his ship and spoke into the apparatus. He said, "Earthlings, I am a Superman out of space." As the automatic translator began to type out this message, the scientists on Earth were hopping up and down in excitement. But the phrase, "Earthlings, I am a Superman out of space," was printed out, due to a lack of harmony between the vibrations of the two parties, as, "People of dirt, I am a virile heterosexual without an apartment." So the message was interpreted as a hoax, because it was too trendy and apparently nonsense by the serious Earthmen. And the spaceman, well, he was rather too serious-minded too. He decided that as there was no reply, the satellite must be broken, so he fed it to his space cat. This podcast is copyright 2018, the Idries Shah Foundation.